We're joined now by Philippine Foreign Secretary Enrique Manalo. Welcome, Secretary. You've come from the Munich Security Conference. You said there that vessels, Filipino vessels, experiencing harassment from China is an almost a daily occurrence. What's being done to prevent that from happening?
Well, really, there's nothing you can do sometimes with the harassment. I mean, it's not only vessels, it's also fishermen. We, of course, have approached China almost regularly every time we learn of a situation. And really, when we explain it to them, our only hope is that they would refrain. But if they're going to impede, at least sometimes should do it in a more friendly way rather than pointing a laser.
What's a more friendly way?
Well, they can at least ask us not to proceed to this area. But it doesn't mean that we would necessarily agree. But unfortunately, that's the situation now in certain parts of the South China Sea, which are actually part of our exclusive economic zone, where we actually have the right to take advantage of whatever resources are there and not be, let's say, prevented from doing so.
There doesn't appear to be any obvious way to stop it.
There's no direct way at the moment because what can you do if you have two parties and one party insists that's its territory? China does claim parts of our EEZ, and certainly they consider it part of their territory, but we do not. So it boils down to them preventing us from using parts of our exclusive economic zone. The problem is they deny that they actually have prevented us from doing it, sometimes saying that they did not really prevent us, they were just guiding us away from certain areas. So it's one of those things.
Now, it's been quite a few years since the Philippines won its arbitration case in The Hague. China, of course, still seems determined to ignore it. How has this ruling really helped the Philippines then?
Well, it has confirmed at least the fact that the Chinese claim, or the so-called 9-dash line, does not hold water and is inconsistent with the UN Convention on Law of the Sea. And because of this, we have garnered support from various countries on the interpretation of that ruling. Of course, China does not recognize the rulings. All we can really do at this stage is continue to stress the rule of law. And if there are any differences or disputes, they should be settled in accordance with the rule of law.
This week, one official has said that Washington and Manila are exploring joint Coast Guard patrols. Washington is also increasing its military presence in the Philippines. How would you describe the Philippine position now in terms of balancing U.S. and China ties?
Well, as of every country in the region, we're faced with the growing U.S.-China rivalry. Actually, what is these arrangements we have with the United States are really part of our existing treaty, the Mutual Defense Treaty, and more specifically the Visiting Forces Agreements. But many of these operations are really aimed at improving our humanitarian disasters or natural disasters, aside from perhaps also serving, if necessary, training in case we run any security threats.
President Marcos has articulated that the Philippines will be a friend to all and an enemy to none. This will clearly not always be possible, especially given that the U.S. and the Philippines are treaty allies. What sort of red lines does the Philippines have that would make it invoke the Mutual Defense Treaty that it has with the U.S.?
Being friends to all, or friends, doesn't necessarily mean you don't have any problems with your friends or any issues. But we, as friends, the whole idea is if we have differences, we should try and resolve them peacefully or at least in a friendly way. That's what we're trying to say. And in the case of China, we do have extensive relations with China, especially on the economic front. And there's always been this understanding, at least for the past few years, that the differences we have in the West Philippine Sea or South China Sea are not the sum total of our relationship. Nevertheless, we do have differences there. So while we wish to, let's say, enhance our economic ties, we also need to address the challenges we face in the South China Sea.
Is it really possible to isolate economic ties with China from the wider security concerns of the region?
Well, that's the challenge. That's why I think we live in a very complex world. That's why, in many ways, it's not as simple as it was, let's say, during the Cold War. Because you have differences, yet you have strong areas of cooperation. And many interests are involved. So it's really a matter of trying to see how you can manage it. But we do have to see, we do have to keep on harping on the need to address these differences fairly and squarely. And as the President has said, I mean, with these many incidents in the South China Sea, it does take a toll on public opinion. And we have tried to bring this to the attention of China, that we, as much as we want to be friends, we also have to address the concerns of the Philippine public. And incidents in the South China Sea do not help.
There's also, of course, the possibility that the wider situation in the region deteriorates. Let's assume that anything can be on the table, from a full-scale invasion of Taiwan by China to an incursion on the outlying islands that are controlled by Taipei. What is the Philippines' plan in case any of this happens?
Of course, I can't divulge the plans, but there are plans. But our policy here is really to see that nothing serious happens. I mean, no military conflict occurs in Taiwan, because our view is that, well, first of all, aside from the fact we have 150,000 Filipinos, Taiwan is only, the southernmost tip of Taiwan is only about 70 kilometers from the northernmost tip of the Philippines in Luzon. So obviously any military conflict there will most likely directly affect the Philippines. That is our main concern, is preventing or helping to prevent a conflict, so we don't have to undertake whatever emergency actions to get back our Filipinos safely.
When you say helping to prevent the conflict, what does that mean?
We always have told the main parties that, for example, when the tensions rose last year, that we urge them to stay in touch with each other regularly. We don't know how they stay in touch, but hopefully their military and political leaders are in touch to talk and see whether, to prevent any kind of incident from escalating. So that's something we have to certainly help to prevent. That's what.
I'm interested in this particular point. Does the Philippines have a say? Do we have any leverage over these two countries that would prevent them from going to war with each other?
Well, we may not have leverage, but we can voice our concerns to them. And we could also say, always mention the implications, which we do. Whenever we talk about Taiwan, whether to the United States, China, we're speaking from a concerned country in the region. And our hope is that any incident does not escalate to conflict. That's the way we can help. Of course, we cannot control what they do, but we can always speak and voice our concerns.
Citing again the expansion of the American military presence in the Philippines, what does this decision say about the level of concern about whether this invasion of Taiwan or an escalation could happen?
Well, actually, the way this operates is not that the American forces are there the whole time. They're there only for certain operations and then they leave. It's not necessarily, I'd say, as some would like to say, there because of the USChina rivalry, but it's really part of the ongoing visiting forces arrangement with the Philippines, addressing perhaps even our own security needs, because it also provides training to our forces. And in that way, it does help us.
Well, the Chinese certainly seem to think that this does have a lot to do, in fact, with the US-China rivalry in the region. They have said that countries in the region should avoid being coerced and used by the United States. That was in reference to the bases. How have you responded?
That seems to be the basic line. And, I think that maybe one of the issues there for China is they view everything in the prism of the US-China rivalry. Whereas in our case, we try and make the point that the situation is a little bit more complex because we have our own legitimate national interests in this. So, for example, if our fishermen are harassed, and we complain. We're not doing it because the United States told us to complain. We're doing it because these fishermen have complained. And it becomes, in a way, a national issue because their livelihood is being affected. And so it's not necessarily because of the US-China rivalry. We have our own direct concerns which are affected. And of course, our right to use the EEZ. I don't think that has anything to do with the US-China rivalry as far as we're concerned. So our only hope is that China takes a more nuanced view of why we are sometimes protesting, and not necessarily because it's a US-China issue.
Analysts have argued that for the U.S. to be a truly effective counter for China in the region, it should step up its economic contribution to the region instead of concentrating purely on military and defense. Do you subscribe to that view?
Yes, we've made that point with the United States, that it would be good if their economic imprint could also increase in our region. I think many countries have made the point. The United States now is taking the lead in the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework exercise, but it's still in its nascent stages, so we have to see how that develops. But it's essentially aimed at increasing economic ties between the Indo-Pacific countries in the Indo-Pacific, so we'll have to see how that develops. But certainly, we feel it would always be good if the U.S. Economic imprint, as well as the EU's economic imprint in our region, would become bigger.
Does this mean you do not think the U.S. and the EU are doing enough?
They could probably do more. They're doing something, but they could probably do more. And there were some ideas, some suggestions that the EU should also consider increasing its economic presence in the Indo-Pacific region, including the Philippines, because that in many ways would help not only development and economic ties, but also increase the influence of and contribute to having a more free and open region, and a region more run on the basis of the rule of law.
It was a hope of the previous administration, of course, that China will deliver a lot in terms of infrastructure, in terms of investment. Not that much of what was promised was actually delivered in the end. The current government of Ferdinand Marcos Jr., he is also looking to pursue deals in infrastructure, agriculture, tourism. How confident is he that the Chinese would deliver a little bit more for him than they did for Duterte?
Well, we're hopeful because when the president visited China last month, and there were a round of meetings amongst businessmen, not government to government, but business, and quite a number of investment pledges were made. I think almost $22 billion worth. So we're hopeful that this will actually materialize, because there was definite interest on the part of the Chinese investors to come to the Philippines. So we really have to see how much of this can be translated into actual projects. We hope it does, because that would certainly be a big boon to our economy, and also be a source of employment.
I suppose, because there is a key difference between now and then, between when Duterte made these deals and when Marcos has now made these deals, and that is, of course, the positioning towards the U.S. Why would they deliver more for the Philippines now?
Well, it would benefit China. I think also for investment-wise. It's, in terms of business, the whole idea is to see how we can promote economic ties, and then get the businessmen and the people to profit from it. And we have also recently signed into the RCEP, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, which China is also a member with 14 other countries. So I think these are meant to, these are actually economic or business transactions. So basically you would go in there only if you would benefit. And I think that's how China would hopefully that's how they view it.
Perhaps just speaking from the perspective of Germany, there's been a lot of review of the idea that economic engagement brings countries into the community of nations, and Germany has learned this lesson the hard way with regard to Russia. Doesn't the Philippines have similar worries with regard to its entanglement with China, like not a democratic state, an authoritarian one?
Well, we don't actually have a policy to prevent that. What we do is have a policy of diversifying our interests. So, for example, when we say we are friends to all, that includes also economic ties. So just last week, the president went to Japan, and we also had a number of investment agreements there amounting to almost $14 billion. And we have extensive arrangements with Australia and other countries. So we are trying to not put our eggs all in one basket. And that's exactly what we mean, or that's part of the meaning of our independent foreign policy. So while we have no particular policy to, let's say, minimize relations with any countries, we seek to maximize relations with as many countries as possible.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.